Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today entitled Drug Development of Treatments for Narcolepsy, Racing to the Approval of New Therapeutics. My name is Shannon Woodruff, and I'm the Marketing Manager here at Clinolabs, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's webinar is being presented by Clinolabs Drug Development Corporation. And before we get started, I'd like to just cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we welcome you to revisit the content at any time and share it with your colleagues. We also invite your questions and comments. Please take a moment to identify the interaction panel on the right side of your screen. If you think of a question at any point during the presentation, please add it to the questions tab, and Dr. Zammit will address these at the end of the event during the Q&A section. Our presenters today are Monica Gao, Founder and Executive Director of Wake Up Narcolepsy, which is an international nonprofit organization. Their mission is to accelerate narcolepsy research, increase awareness, and support people with narcolepsy. Also with us today is Dr. Gary Zammit, President and CEO of Clinolabs. Dr. Zammit is a neuroscientist and sleep specialist. He is widely known as a key opinion leader in the field of sleep medicine and has been involved in the development of new drugs to treat sleep disorders such as narcolepsy, insomnia, excessive sleepiness, and circadian rhythm disorders. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Monica, take it away.
Hello, and thank you, Shannon, for the introduction, and Dr. Zammit for inviting me here today to represent Wake Up Narcolepsy. As Shannon mentioned, I am co-founder and executive director of Wake Up Narcolepsy, which is a nonprofit organization established in 2008, 6 months after my then 10-year-old son was diagnosed with narcolepsy and cataplexy. He's 25 now. We were compelled to start Wake Up Narcolepsy for several reasons, including what we learned narcolepsy to actually be as a medical disorder, and that people can go 10 years plus before getting an accurate diagnosis. We knew we needed to do something to help this community, and Wake Up Narcolepsy was born. It took us 3 months to get my son diagnosed, and we couldn't imagine going 10 years or longer. Wake Up Narcolepsy's mission is to accelerate narcolepsy research, increase awareness of narcolepsy, educate, and provide supportive services for people in the community. With our grant awards this year, Wake Up Narcolepsy has donated a total of $1.2 million to accelerate narcolepsy research. And we do this through grassroots fundraising. We have published our impact statement of our research on our news page on the Wake Up Narcolepsy website. Wake Up Narcolepsy also provides supportive services to the community, including education sessions, both in-person conferences and webinars, and we work to increase awareness of narcolepsy. With all the activity in the narcolepsy space, we help to bring new drug treatments to people with narcolepsy. Please visit wakeupnarcolepsy.org for more information and follow us on social media. We are on all of the platforms. And with that, I will now turn it over to Dr. Gary Zammit.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you for representing Wake Up Narcolepsy to the audience here today. I think as part of my presentation, I'll be talking a bit about how important patient participation is and community support is for the development of new treatments for narcolepsy. So I especially appreciate your participation today. So I've titled my presentation, Clinical Drug Development and Treatments for Narcolepsy, Racing to the Approval of New Therapeutics, because there really is a bit of a race going on in the clinical development world today. Recent years have shown many new advances in the understanding of narcolepsy and of its causes, and this has really fueled the development of new therapeutics or the interest in new therapeutics. And the goal is really to leverage what we've learned from a scientific perspective and see if that information can be turned into meaningful improvements in the treatments that we're able to offer for people with narcolepsy. So without further delay, I'll go right into the presentation. For those of you who don't know me, though, I'm a PhD in neuroscientist. I am board certified in sleep medicine, and I'm the founder and CEO of Clinilabs, which is a CRO that's dedicated to CNS drug development. I'm a shareholder. These are my disclosures. Any references that I make to marketed products or drugs in development that I show in this presentation are really representative examples only, and they're not intended to advocate or endorse any specific treatment or treatment approach. All of the information that I'm showing in this presentation is available in the public domain. So it's available through your library or medical library, or even online through Google. So we know that many people with narcolepsy remain unidentified. Only 22% of sleep specialists and 7% of primary care physicians can identify all 5 key narcolepsy symptoms. And those being excessive daytime sleepiness, cataplexy, disturbed nighttime sleep, hypnagogic hallucinations, and sleep paralysis. So with many physicians not feeling comfortable or knowledgeable about narcolepsy, only about 9% of primary care physicians feel very or extremely comfortable diagnosing the disorder. So many people often go unidentified, and even when they are identified, they may go untreated or undertreated. Of those patients identified with narcolepsy, about 57% still experience excessive daytime sleepiness or fatigue 3 or more times per day, despite ongoing treatment. And we know that cataplexy itself can be resistant to the available treatments that are out there. Even when people do get a benefit from medicine, they're sometimes plagued by adverse events or adverse experiences that make it difficult for them to stay on the medicines that they're on. So we need new and better treatments. Now, within recent years, we've identified new mechanisms of action that are involved in narcolepsy, and particularly in the orexin system. And this system, the orexin system, has now become a target for the development of new medicines. Medicines that are available currently, and some in development as well, provide symptom relief. In other words, they may help people to stay awake during the day, or may help to reduce the amount of cataplexy or number of cataplexy attacks or severity of cataplexy attacks that people experience. But because we now know that an orexin deficiency or a deficiency in orexin signaling is the underlying cause of type 1 narcolepsy, that's narcolepsy with cataplexy, we believe that developing drugs that act on the orexin system have the potential to be truly disease modifying. So the new mechanism of action that's out there is really exciting and leading to a lot of interest. So there are many new drugs that are being considered for development, and we really have to ask ourselves, how are these new medicines different from the existing therapeutics? What benefits do they offer over what's available to the patient today? How do these different medicines that are being considered for development different from each other? How will they be tested and approved? And which one will be first to get approved? And does it really matter to patients which medicine is first, which one is second, if there is a first or a second? These are all questions that people have, and we're going to try to consider some of these questions as we talk today. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page with regard to definitions, we know that there are 2 types of narcolepsy identified by the International Classification of Sleep Disorders. Narcolepsy type 1, that's narcolepsy with cataplexy, is defined by daily periods of irrepressible need for sleep or daytime lapses into sleep for at least 3 months. So it's excessive daytime sleepiness or sleep attacks lasting at least 3 months, and the presence of one or both of the following: cataplexy, which is a sudden loss of muscle tone. It can be a slight loss of muscle tone, or a very severe loss of muscle tone where literally the person with cataplexy kind of collapses down onto themselves and can't sustain posture. Or a mean sleep latency on the MSLT, the multiple sleep latency tests, of 8 minutes or less, and 2 or more rapid eye movement or REM sleep onsets on the MSLT. And then lastly, the CSF hypocretin 1 concentration is low in type 1 narcolepsy, either less 110 or less picograms per milliliter, or less than a third of the mean values obtained from normal subjects. So here we're kind of defining type 1 as excessive sleepiness, cataplexy, and a deficiency in the orexin system. But type 1 narcolepsy isn't all the type of narcolepsy that we've defined. There is now also type 2 narcolepsy. And essentially, this is narcolepsy without cataplexy. So similarly, we have the daily periods of irrepressible need for sleep, or daytime lapses into sleep lasting at least 3 months, a mean sleep latency of 8 minutes or less on the MSLT with REM sleep onsets. But here we have the absence of cataplexy, and either the hypocretin level has not been measured, or it's above 110 picograms per milliliter, or greater than a third of the mean values obtained from normal subjects. And then finally, hypersomnolence, the excessive sleepiness, or MSLT findings, not better explained by other causes, such as another sleep disorder. So that's really a narcolepsy type 1 and type 2. There are other disorders of excessive somnolence, like idiopathic hypersomnia, but we're not going to go into those disorders here today. We're going to stay focused on narcolepsy. Now, when we're developing new treatments for narcolepsy, and even the old treatments for narcolepsy, they focus on 2 primary outcomes. And those are here in the green. You can see excessive sleepiness and cataplexy. Those are really the 2 primary outcomes that we're looking at in terms of documenting efficacy for a new drug treatment. But there are other symptoms that are very important as well. Those include disturbed nighttime sleep. We know that people with narcolepsy suffer from terrible disturbances of nighttime sleep. Sleep fragmentation and disrupted sleep makes it difficult for them to get through the night. Hypnagogic hallucinations, or even hypnopompic hallucinations. These are those very vivid dream-like hallucinations that come on just at sleep onset or just upon awakening. And then sleep paralysis, the inability to move one's muscles voluntarily just at sleep onset or just at sleep offset. And sometimes the hypnagogic hallucinations and sleep paralysis occur together, which can make it very disturbing, very frightening for the person who's experiencing it, especially if the hallucinatory experience is aggressive or frightening, experiencing something frightening and being unable to move. So those are other symptoms of narcolepsy that are important. And then beyond that, we have to consider social, academic, occupational adjustment of people with narcolepsy. Often the fact that narcolepsy is comorbid with certain psychiatric symptoms like depression or anxiety. And narcolepsy comes with its own package of other health concerns like weight gain. Weight gain is very common in people with narcolepsy. So when we're looking at treatments for narcolepsy, and we're developing new drug treatments for narcolepsy, well, we focus on those primary treatment targets of excessive sleepiness and cataplexy, but there is a lot more going on with the patient than just those two things. And as we get more advanced in our understanding of narcolepsy and the treatment approaches that we can and should take, it's going to be important that we take into consideration the full symptom picture. Maybe not are all going to be targets for drug treatment, but it's something that we need to consider as we look at treatment overall. And and even if, for example, if we improve sleepiness and cataplexy, do any of these other things really get better? It would be nice to know if they did. So there are a number of treatments for narcolepsy currently available. This is a list of medicines that are available, including modafinil, pitolisant, sodium oxybate, solriamfetol, armodafinil, dextroamphetamine, methylphenidate, and so on. This list or table is adapted from a standards of practice paper that was authored by Maskey and Associates. And the strength of recommendation here, when it's strong, they're suggesting that most, if not all, people with narcolepsy might be exposed to a treatment like this. And when it's conditional, it might be a particular subsample of people with narcolepsy that this treatment might be appropriate for. And you can see that many of these medicines are appropriate for excessive daytime sleepiness. Pitolisant, sodium oxybate have improved cataplexy. If we look at overall disease severity, if say a clinical global impressions of disease severity, most of these medicines have been shown to have an impact on disease severity, and some have an impact on quality of life that's been documented. So these are all medicines currently indicated or approved specifically for narcolepsy, but there are other medicines that have historically been used in treating narcolepsy. And for example, these are antidepressants that have been used to treat cataplexy, including venlafaxine, atomoxetine, fluoxetine, and so on. There's an asterisk here by reboxetine because that is one drug that is currently in active development for a narcolepsy indication, or has been in active development for a narcolepsy indication. So there are these medicines that have historically been used, but they've been used off-label as treatments for narcolepsy. There is one medication that is an extended release form of sodium oxybate that is currently awaiting approval. And that's a medicine that was developed by Avadel. Avadel received a tentative approval letter from the FDA on July 18th of this year. They are expecting a final approval in June of 2023 or sooner. And the data on the extended release form of sodium oxybate shows some promise here in that their studies of 222 patients with narcolepsy were found to meet all three primary endpoints, and that's change from baseline in mean sleep latency on the MWT, the maintenance of wakefulness test. It means that people were able to sustain wakefulness longer. On the clinical global impressions improvement scale, and on the number of cataplexy attacks per week. So they're showing efficacy data, and they're also showing that when people are considering switch from their current treatment to a once nightly treatment, many patients say that they prefer the once nightly dosing regimen over a twice nightly dosing regimen. Right now, sodium oxybate is taken in divided doses, so 2 doses, one at the beginning of the night, one in the middle of the night. And they're saying people would prefer to have just a 1 dose option. So this particular drug is still pending approval. If it is approved, it probably will be the next approved drug indicated for narcolepsy that's available to patients. So many questions about the drug development process and the clinical development process. Um, how long does it take? What are the study designs? What are the key outcomes? What are the benefits and risks for subjects? What drugs are in development now? What are the challenges that we face in development? There are probably more questions than there are answers, but we'll try to address some of those questions here. For those of you who are curious about the drug development process, it is a fairly lengthy process. This is a graphic that's adapted from the U.S. Pharma report. You can see that that it takes a lot of medicines. If you look at the left slide of the illustration, it takes a lot of medicines in discovery to get a fraction of them into preclinical development. That's work with animals. So about 5,000 new drugs discovered at the bench to get 250 into preclinical testing. Once that preclinical testing is done and a full package of information is collected, a pharmaceutical or biotechnology company can submit what is called an investigational new drug application, an IND, to the United States Food and Drug Administration. Once that IND is submitted and there are no holds on that IND, then the company is able to carry their drug forward into human clinical trials. Human clinical trials go in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. There's also a phase 4, which are studies that occur after approval, but pre-approval, it's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. It looks here like they always run in sequence. First you do phase 1, then you do phase 2, then you do phase 3. They don't always run in quite that sequence, but for all intents and purposes, phase 1 is where we begin with first in human. And you can see of those 250 drugs that were seen in preclinical testing, about 5 will make it forward into phase 1. And those that are successful in phase 1 will move on to phase 2, and then if successful into phase 3. And you can see of those 5 that made it into phase 1, about 1 new FDA-approved drug will result. So we go from about 5,000 drugs in discovery through the gauntlet and through attrition to maybe 1 new FDA-approved drug. And you can see at the bottom of this illustration how many years it takes, 3 to 6 years to get through discovery and preclinical, at least 6 to 7 years to get through human clinical trials, and then another year or more for review and approval by FDA. And we're going to talk about the other element that's on this slide. We'll talk about this near the end of the conversation, and that's the number of volunteers needed for these various stages of development. So let's talk about these phases of development. Phase 1 studies are studies in small groups of healthy people, maybe 20 to 80 people, to determine drug safety. That's the most important thing about phase 1, is that we want to determine if the drug is safe in human subjects. So we look at adverse effects, adverse experiences after the medicine has been administered, and the maximum tolerated dose, the highest dose that a person can take without feeling any untoward effects. And the doses that we start out with in human trials are based on the prior animal work. So we want to start out at doses that are very small, very low, and then progressively go up to doses that we might think might have some type of therapeutic effect later on. Very often when we're working in the central nervous system, we're looking at pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of the drug. In other words, how quickly is the drug absorbed? How quickly does it reach its maximum concentration in the blood? What is the maximum concentration in the blood? and whether and how that drug is eliminated, how quickly does it get out of the system. And then relative to all of that, we're looking at whether or not there are any pharmacodynamic effects. What does the drug do? Is this drug designed to help keep you awake? Do we see any signs that this might be stimulating wakefulness? Or are there other things that the drug is doing that might be of relative importance? Once we have a good idea of drug safety and a little better understanding of kinetics and dynamics in phase 1, then we move into either proof of concept studies or phase 2 studies in patients. In phase 2, we're now moving from healthy, normal people who have been given the medicine to patient populations. And we want to see whether or not we get a good drug effect if the drug seems to be effective for the condition that we want to treat, and whether or not it's safe, and whether or not there seems to be any kind of dose response. If you give the lowest dose, do you get any response at all? And if you give a higher dose, are you getting a response? And if you give a yet even higher dose, is the response improved or increased? So phase 2 really lets us understand how patients themselves respond to the medicine. And phase 2 studies very often include very, very highly defined, well-defined groups of people with the conditions under study. And if that's narcolepsy, it's a very tightly defined group of people with narcolepsy, because we really want to understand in a very narrowly defined patient population, do we have efficacy? Do we have safety? And is there a dose response? Now, phase 2 studies really inform what happens later. So in phase 3, we're studying much larger groups of people, and we want to get a really good idea of the efficacy and safety of the drug when it's administered. Now, the group of people under study here, they're still a very well-defined group, maybe not quite as narrowly defined as in phase 2, because we want to do a little more mirroring of what the population will be that will eventually be getting this medication after it's approved, if it should be approved. And these phase 3 trials are also known as pivotal trials. These are the key studies that the FDA looks at when they're determining whether or not a drug should be approved. And then there is phase 4, as I mentioned. These phase 4 studies are usually done after a drug is approved for marketing, and the pharmaceutical company or sponsor can look at adverse effects or other factors in that large group of patients. Okay, so let's just run through a little bit about phase 1. Phase 1, we have kind of 2 different types of studies. Single ascending dose studies. These are studies where subjects are dosed in very small groups, maybe 6 to 8 subjects per group. Each subject either receives active drug or placebo. The first group in a single ascending dose study gets the lowest dose to be tested. And then after that dose is administered, and we get blood levels and we assess safety and adverse events, there's usually a committee that does that. So it's not done blindly. So get all the data, the committee reviews everything and decides, well, it seems like it's safe to go to the next highest dose, or nope, it's not safe and we're going to stop. But in most cases, because the earlier research has been so good, the study is able to proceed to the next highest dose. And so the next highest dose is administered to another group of 6 or 8 normal healthy volunteers. And then a safety review is done. And if everything seems safe, then it goes to the next highest dose and so on. So those are called single ascending dose studies, and they're critically important to establishing the safety of a medicine. And again, I can't underscore enough how important phase 1 studies are to safety. Safety is always paramount in clinical trials that are being done for any drug, including drugs in central nervous system disorders and narcolepsy. The next type of study that is done in phase 1 is called a multiple ascending dose study. And here, the medicine is being tested to determine if we give multiple doses of the medicine over time, if the drug is still safe. So you might get one dose of the medicine on a Monday, and then another dose of the medicine on a Tuesday, and another dose of the medicine on a Thursday, of the same dose, but you get it on multiple administrations. And still same small group, normal healthy volunteers, but if the drug is still shown to be safe with multiple administrations at that same dose, then the researchers can move on to the next dose level. And the next group of patients or subjects, these are normal healthy volunteers, would get multiple doses of that administration, of that drug administered at the same dose, to determine if that's safe, and then another committee meeting, and if it's safe, then to the next highest dose. So the multiple ascending dose is important because we know that in most of clinical medicine, patients don't take just one dose of a medicine, they take the medicine every day. So we want to see what happens if somebody's getting this medicine every day. Does it still seem to be safe? Now, in narcolepsy studies, and in many areas of CNS, but in narcolepsy studies as well, we do what are called proof of concept studies. And these are experimental models that we have designed to see if a medicine has a pharmacodynamic effect, if it's doing what it's supposed to do. And in one common model that we use in testing wake-promoting drugs, we look at normal healthy volunteers and we induce sleepiness. In other words, we sleep deprive people and we keep them awake, and then they get administered a dose of medication, dose of the test drug, versus a placebo in a randomized double-blind way. So double-blind, they don't know what they're getting, the experimenter doesn't know what they're getting, and the administrations are random. So in this group of sleep-deprived people, does the active drug then show any evidence that it's going to promote wakefulness? We often do this by looking at a key outcome, and that is the maintenance of wakefulness test. I'll tell you a little more about that in a moment. And then we look at secondary outcomes like self-reported sleepiness or psychomotor vigilance tasks like reaction time. The psychomotor vigilance test, the PVT, that's a very commonly used test of reaction time. And there are other indicia of sleepiness that we also can look at to see if there's separation between the active drug and the placebo. Just first to give you just a quick primer on the difference between the MWT and the MSLT, because they're terms I've used here in this presentation. The MWT is a procedure that assesses the subject's ability to stay awake while resisting the pressure to fall asleep under sleep-promoting circumstances. The MSLT is a PSG measure of the subject's ability to fall asleep. And the tests are very, very similar in that the subject is put into a darkened room. They are asked to rest and recline. But in the MWT, the subject is asked to stay awake. In the MSLT, the subject is asked to go ahead and fall asleep. So the MWT, you have to resist the urge to fall asleep. We found that the MWT is a sensitive test to drug treatment effects, and that's why it's used. Here's an experimental design where we were testing a drug called lisdexamfetamine, 20, 50, or 70 milligrams compared to placebo and compared to armodafinil or Nuvigil. And 135 subjects were seen, and you can see on this illustration what the study was like. Subjects had, they checked into the research unit, They had an overnight sleep polysomnogram, so they were tested objectively. And then during that day, they had PVTs, that's the reaction time test. They had several of those throughout the day. And then around 7:45, they got their dose of either 20/50 or 70 lisdexamfetamine, 250 armodafinil, or placebo. It was all double blind and all randomized and counterbalanced. And then they were sleep deprived. And then periodically throughout the night, the maintenance of wakefulness test was performed. So they had to lay awake in a darkened room and try to resist the urge to fall asleep. Now, if a drug is a wake promoting drug, theoretically, they would have longer latency to sleep onset on the MWT. It would take them longer to fall asleep than placebo. And that was really the primary thing we were looking for. And then we did sleep PSGs afterwards to test them. But this is what this particular study showed, and I only use it here as an illustration of the model. And I know this may be a little difficult to read, but what you can see here is that people who had placebo fell asleep on the MWT much more quickly than those who received either armodafinil or the various doses of lisdexamfetamine. And on the horizontal axis here, you're seeing the different time of the MWT. So there were 6 different MWT sessions that were done from left to right. And then on the vertical axis, you're seeing the number of minutes it took to fall asleep. And you can see the line at the bottom. Well, that's placebo. People fell asleep pretty quickly or reasonably quickly after they were starting the test. But if they were on armodafinil or lisdexamfetamine, it took them much longer. And these values were statistically significant. They separated from placebo. And the reason that I show it here is that it's a model that we use to see if there is a wake promoting effect of a medication, if this medication is really worth going into the next phase of testing, which is phase 2. So let's talk about phase 2. So in phase 2, now we're moving into people with narcolepsy, hopefully a very tightly defined group of people who have narcolepsy, either type 1 or type 2, and then testing a nice well-defined group to see if they separate from placebo. And here, this is if you look at the lower left quadrant there, you see that in this study, 49 patients got placebo, 44 patients got JZP-110, that's solriamfetol, and then we were able to look and see over a period of 12 weeks whether or not people had lower levels of sleepiness on the maintenance of wakefulness test, and also other measures there. And I know the graphics are very, very small, hard to read, but if you just look at the upper right quadrant, you can see that on the maintenance of wakefulness test, those in the placebo group, well, they fell asleep on the maintenance of wakefulness test much faster than those in the active drug condition. And they also reported, or the clinicians reported, more sleepiness in the placebo group than in the active drug group. Important thing here I want you to keep in mind is if you look, take a look, left upper quadrant, the total number of subjects assessed for this study, 213 subjects for this study, phase 2. There we're just looking at sleepiness, but cataplexy also is a critical endpoint for narcolepsy type 1 trials, because cataplexy, as we know, it's one of the most debilitating symptoms of narcolepsy. It's one of the things that can be so interfering with somebody's ability to function in life and quality of life. So if we're going to have a treatment for narcolepsy type 1, we want a treatment that can address cataplexy. So we're very often looking at the number of cataplectic attacks experienced per day or per week. And we're looking at that over an extended period of time. In these studies, you can see the observation period is about 12 weeks. And in this study, there's also a randomized withdrawal during the course of treatment where everybody gets taken off of drug, and you can see if there's any kind of rebound of symptoms after they've been on drug. Now let's take a look at phase 3. Well, the big thing about phase 3 is that now we've narrowed down the doses of medication that we think are going to be appropriate, but now we need perhaps larger samples of subjects in phase 3. And in this study, the investigators, I wasn't involved in this one, but the investigators had 239 subjects getting solriamfetol 75, 150, or 300 milligrams for 12 weeks. The maintenance of wakefulness test and the patient global impressions were co-primary endpoints. And you can see here that the active drug separated from placebo on those co-primary endpoints. But and this is daily dosing of people taking the medicine. But here you can see in phase 3, we need generally larger samples of patients. Oh, and then lastly, often in phase 3, before a drug is approved, the patients who have participated in those efficacy studies to determine if there's efficacy and safety, they very often get rolled into long-term safety studies, where after they've completed their 12 weeks or so of treatment, the studies they can vary in duration, but the ones I've shown you are 12 weeks. After they do 12 weeks, they can then go out for an additional 40 weeks. So the experimenters can look at safety following 12 months of exposure, a full year of exposure. And this helps to document that the medicine is safe for continued use. And this is very important to FDA. And again, it's all about safety and making sure that we have medicines that are marketed to the public that are safe medicines. So we get the 12 months of safety, and usually as a secondary endpoint. These studies are not powered or designed to look at efficacy, but very often some efficacy data will be collected to determine if there is a maintenance of the treatment effect, and that can also be then reported on. Now, I mentioned at the top of the presentation that there are many new drugs in development for narcolepsy, and we are very fortunate to have learned so much through the research of people like Dr. Emmanuel Mignot at Stanford about the orexin system and how critically important that system is to the cause of narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is a deficiency in the orexin system, deficiency in orexin signaling that probably impacts not only wakefulness, but also cataplexy. So a lot of medicines have now been under consideration for as treatments for narcolepsy. And here is a list. I'm going to say this is a partial list of new drugs in development for narcolepsy. I'm saying a partial list because this is a list of medicines or investigational drugs that has been publicly reported or that have been publicly reported. There may be others that have not yet been publicly reported, but here you can see many of these are orexin 2 agonists. In other words, they serve to promote activity in the orexin system or at the orexin system or at the orexin receptor, particularly the orexin 2 receptor. That seems to be the key receptor involved in narcolepsy. And you can see here Takeda, Jazz, Orexia, Alkermes, NLS, they all have drugs that act on the orexin system. And then there are other companies that are involved in looking at other mechanisms of action in narcolepsy. But if you take a look at these, 8 or 10 companies that are working in this area, you can see that some of them are very early on, like TAC 861, early clinical, JZP 441, not yet in clinic, Orexia, not yet in clinic, Alkermes, not yet in clinic, XW, early clinical. And this is taken off of the sponsor company websites. So what you see is that there's a lot of interest in this area. And based on that, I would venture to say that we're going to have in the next year or 2 or 3 a race to the approval of the next therapeutic for narcolepsy. And when we think about that race, being fast and being first, that's important to pharmaceutical companies because they can get an early command of the market. They may get brand exclusivity for some point or for some period of time. The race is also important to patients because people with narcolepsy have been waiting for the next new treatment opportunity or treatment option. And they really desire access to new, effective, and safe treatments as soon as possible. So there's going to be a lot going on in the field of narcolepsy over the next few years. I'm just guessing, but I anticipate that we're going to see between 5 and 10 clinical development programs in narcolepsy type 1, type 2, idiopathic hypersomnia, and other related indications in the near future. But let's say that there are 5 programs that go forward in the field of narcolepsy. Let's take a look at what that really means. And here's the big challenge for all of us stakeholders in the field. If we have 5 new narcolepsy programs going on, and each narcolepsy program requires a minimum of 400 patients with narcolepsy, that means that we may need between 1,500 and 2,000 unique patients to enroll in clinical trials. If our pre-screen failure rate for narcolepsy studies, if that pre-screen failure rate is around 76%, and we know that based on experience and on some published data, and the in-office screen failure rate is thereafter a little more than 50%, which we know from experience, we probably need around 20,000 study candidates to be pre-screened to fulfill all the study needs. That 20,000 number represents approximately 10% of those people with narcolepsy in the United States today. That's a huge percentage. So it's going to take a village to get these trials done. The industry will need patient participation and support from the patient community. I think industry will have to complement that with efforts to make it easier for patients to participate in narcolepsy trials, perhaps modifying traditional study designs, modifying inclusion and exclusion criteria, making them a little more flexible, lowering the subject burden so it's not so difficult for people with narcolepsy to participate, maybe have to wash out of their existing treatments and then be without treatment for so many days, which is really very difficult for people with narcolepsy to do. And then I think one of the other challenges is making sure that we consider all those endpoints, all those things that I talked to you about in the beginning, considering those endpoints that don't often work their way into clinical trials, things other than sleepiness and cataplexy. So in summing up, we have a tremendous need for new drug treatments in narcolepsy. The development of new treatments for narcolepsy follow a familiar and traditional development pathway from phase 1 to phase 3. Assessment of safety in phase 1 is critical. Assessment of pharmacodynamics and early effects on sleepiness and cataplexy are critical in proof of concept studies. And then the assessment of efficacy and safety in phases 2 and 3 studies are essential for submission of a new drug application. There are many new candidates under consideration for narcolepsy. Most of them now act on the orexin system, but not all. And they all have potential for symptom improvement. Those drugs that act at the orexin system may have potential for disease modification. So it's going to be very interesting to see how things evolve as these new medicines go into development. And then lastly, there are both opportunities and challenges to be faced in doing these trials and getting these new medicines evaluated. Opportunities to have some better study designs and to include some of the key outcomes that are really important to people who are suffering from narcolepsy. Challenges, making sure that the studies are populated fully and that we have good participation from the patient community in these trials to evaluate medicines that could potentially come forward and help them. So with that, I will stop the slides and open the stage for any questions. We have a few minutes for questions if you have them.
Thank you very much, Monica and Dr. Zammit. A reminder to the audience, if you do have a question, now would be the time to put it in the questions tab. Doesn't look like any questions have come in yet. You could wait a minute if you'd like, Dr. Zammit.
Yeah, we'll wait a minute in case anyone has one. Well, in the meantime, I would be happy to open the presentation up to Monica, just in case Monica has any thoughts about any of these medicines and what the development landscape looks like from your perspective, from the patient community.
I think you summed it up nicely when you said it is a race to the finish line here. And I think the patient community is waiting eagerly to see, what will be available to them. We do recognize that there will be a lot of pressure and need to educate the community about clinical trials and what's ahead of us and the importance of people participating. So we do recognize that. We do try to share, information on all clinical trials through our website and social media and e-blasts. Yeah, we're excited.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
One question did come in.
Oh, I see. Yes. Okay. So the question is, what's your impression of current patient satisfaction with treatment, and what would interest them, patients, in studies? Well, it's hard to read, I think. And thank you for the question. I think it's hard to read because we know that a lot of patients who are on treatment now are still experiencing symptoms. And as I showed at the top of the presentation, almost 2/3 of people with narcolepsy, even though they're treated, are still experiencing excessive daytime sleepiness. And to me, that probably reflects some dissatisfaction with their treatment. But then, if we look on the flip side, if you ask somebody to discontinue their treatment, would they want to give it away? They don't want to, and I think that's probably some sign that they're getting some benefit. Maybe it's not perfect, but they're getting some benefit from the treatments that they have today, benefits that they wouldn't want to abandon. I don't know, Monica, your sense of that?
I agree, Dr. Zammit. I do think it is hard for people with narcolepsy to come off of their medications, even though they might not be perfect. They might be on a regime that allows them to work and work. So that's really a big challenge, getting them to come off of their medications to try new ones.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And another question, well, another one, any biomarker for narcolepsy type 1? Yes. So people can get tested for their orexin levels, for hypocretin 1 or orexin levels, and that is a very good biomarker to assess whether or not they have type 1 narcolepsy or not. That's one thing that is currently available. Another question, that a couple of the drugs showed significant improvements in all categories with the exception of quality of life. What would you attribute this to? I think that one's easy, and that probably has to do with the types of studies that have been done. So if the pharmaceutical company sponsor has done studies on quality of life and have been able to report them, then we have data. But if those studies haven't been done, then we can't make any claims about quality of life.
Okay, looks like there's no more questions coming in. I guess we could wrap up now. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you again, Monica and Dr. Zammit, for your time and expertise. And that's a wrap, guys.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Same to you.
Thank you.
Bye.